Welcome to the ANZPAC Parental Alienation Talk Series. I'm Phil Lamport, National Operations Manager at Parents Beyond Breakup. This month, joining me here in Darwin, Northern Territory, is Pete Nicholls, CEO of Parents Beyond Breakup. Before we kick off, just a quick reminder to those here in the room, if you wish to submit questions, please do so using the QR code dotting it around the room. For those online, please use the link posted in the chat. Pete, PBB recently did some research amongst our clients. Can you provide us with an outline and any insights that you have?
Be happy to. Perhaps we could pull up the presentation. Thank you. So this research was conducted by ourselves. We're Parents Beyond Breakup, suicide prevention support charity operating across Australia, specifically focusing on separated parents. So we do some research every year. This was conducted earlier this year. So if we go to the next slide, please. So if I just give you a very quick overview of what this research was about, it ran May and June, so it's relatively recent. We're still working on the analysis and the interpretation, and we will be publishing the full results on our website before Parental Alienation Day here in Australia on the 12th of October this year. The research went out to over 500 of our clients over the last year or so, and 131 people responded. That's just over a quarter of those that we reached out to, which is a pretty good response rate as far as survey research work goes. Of those, 15 were mums and 116 were dads. That's 11.5% versus 88.5%. That's pretty typical of the demographic split with our client base. We look after mums and dads. We don't have any fear or favor, but that's who walks through the door when we open our doors for support. And the key purpose behind the research, which is probably the most important thing, was for us, we do it annually to better understand our clients and what they need from us. But secondarily, it actually helps to inform relevant academic research in matters relating to parental alienation specifically. And so I'll be sharing some of those insights with you and challenges. If we could jump to the next slide, please. So the first thing I'm going to be looking at today is PA victim demographics, like who are they and what are their perspectives? I'm going to be looking at three things. There's probably about 50 areas that were contained in the research that covered things like suicidality, parental alienation, family domestic violence. But I just extracted three key kind of areas for the purpose of today because we have very limited time. So if we go to the next slide, we'll start looking at who responded around the matter of parental alienation and what can we tell about them. What we're looking at in this graph now is three sets of bars. The one on the far left is all of the parents that responded. The middle one is for mums specifically. The one on the right is fathers. So the one on the far left actually represents the group. You'll notice that all three are similar, which is the first insight that the experience of mums and dads around the matter of parental alienation is quite similar. The orange bars indicate the proportion of clients responding that stated that they had experienced or are experiencing parental alienation. So on average, we're looking at about 91% of our client base is experiencing parental alienation. So it's a matter relevant to our clients, therefore our organization. The green bars, interestingly, in contrast, actually relate to the proportion of those that said yes that would actually be classified officially as parental alienation cases based on the most common professional model that exists, which is the five-factor model developed by Bill Burnett and Amy J. Baker back in 2018, 2020. And it's five factors that, if you look at a particular case, would definitively say, yes, this is a case of parental alienation. I won't go into the detail because we don't have the time today, but you can look up the five-factor theory or model online, or it is actually listed on the top right, the behaviors that are required. The most interesting thing that emerges from this is that only about a third of the cases that came to us and stated they were cases of PA would be officially classed as cases of PA. And there's some very interesting insights that come out of that as to why. The most common thing we hear is that parents are imagining it's not a case of PA. I'm going to challenge that thinking a little bit in the next couple of slides. So if we could move to the next slide, please. And again. So the first thing is that only 1/3 of claimants meet the most common current professional definition of PA. Next, please. interpretation of parental alienation by those parents and the percentage of cases claimed is very similar between the sexes, mums and dads, amongst parents who've been excluded from their children. That's interesting. So mums and dads are looking at this and interpreting and measuring whether they are a case or not in broadly similar ways. If we go next, please. These two factors are quite interesting because there is a disconnect in that first statement between the professionals, or the academics, I should say, and the parents. Yet in the second statement, we see that parents are broadly agreed between themselves on what it is they're looking at. If we go next, please. So the question that arises out of this part of the insight, if you like, the demographic kind of examination or analysis is that if we do have a model that determines a binary yes or no in relation to the matter of parental alienation, then is that actually helpful in terms of a practical approach to identification and interruption of parental alienation at earlier stages? i.e., do we require the patient to definitively expire before we have sufficient evidence to say we should start treating the illness? If the factors require an advanced stage, at which point it might be very difficult to address the matter, the question arises, is a binary yes-no definition the correct way to look at this? Now, this is not to criticize the five-factor model, because I believe it is probably the best definition we have currently, universally, globally, in parental alienation. But is it the correct tool in assessing a case if we're looking to intervene at an earlier stage? That's one of the insights that's going to emerge out of this. Next, please. So insight number one is that interpretation and experience of PA, excluding absolute numbers because mums and dads are at different levels, is actually similar between the sexes. Next, please. The next insight is that PA sits on a spectrum from not being alienated through to being fully alienated. So there are steps in between that, which suggest the need for diagnostic tools and processes suitable to early stage intervention. They may well exist, but if they do, we're not aware of them, and they're certainly not universally known about within our sector. So that's one of the insights and challenges that we're making to, at least to the academics and professionals.
Hey, can I just clarify that? So what we're saying is that the majority, in the case of our clients, are seeing and experiencing parental alienation behaviours.
Yes.
But the professionals wait until there is an end result showing that a child has been alienated before they're willing to say that that is a case of PA.
Yes, and look, I don't think they're wrong in what they're doing, but it's a case of context. It's a little bit like the difference between a doctor and a coroner. You know, a coroner can look at a body and say, this is what happened definitively. But as a doctor, you don't want to wait until that point. You actually want to identify the problem much, much earlier and start putting some sort of intervention in place to prevent it. At the moment, the tools that we have are more in line with the coroner than the doctor. But that's not wrong. It's just the stage of evolution in our sector and the science as it is right now.
So we may not be acting until it's already a bit too late for that relationship.
Yes, exactly. And that's often the experience that we see amongst our clients. If we go to the next slide, please. So the next area I wanted to look at, and like I said, I'm going to look at three areas: the experience of our clients, the demographics, the links with family domestic violence, FDV, and I'm going to look at what parents think they need. That's all we have time for today. But in terms of the links between PA and FDV, this is something that I did not expect to find, but we're sharing it as we find it. We're going with where the evidence goes. So next slide, please. Here we're looking at a number, if we look at these category or groups of bars from left to right, there are 6 of them. They relate to different types of family domestic violence reported by our clients. So from the left to the right, you can see that they are categorized as physical, financial, psychological, sexual, digital stroke online, or no abuse. And in terms of the 3 bars in each group, the 2 gray bars are parents who are either alienated, dark gray, or not alienated, light gray. So there's a difference between the two in their experience of domestic violence. And the orange bar summarizes the difference, the delta, if you like. And we've sorted out the graph from the biggest difference on the far left to the smallest difference on the far right. So what that tells us is that if we look at cases of parental alienation, those parents have suffered roughly a 30% higher rate in aggregate of historical, physical, financial, and psychological abuse prior to them experiencing parental alienation. This is quite important, actually, as I'm going to get into the insights in a moment. So that's the first thing that I want to demonstrate. There appears to be a difference in the experience of family domestic violence in cases of PA. The other one is to look at the tallest bar in the middle, which represents the historical experience of psychological abuse in parents who have later become alienated from their children. So what that is saying, there is 100% overlap between psychological abuse historically and then later being alienated from your children. That may not be a surprise to people because, parental alienation is potentially a form of psychological abuse, but it's an interesting insight when you actually follow the numbers. It gives us an insight that perhaps could be missed by professionals.
So there is always a precursor. If parental alienation has happened or is happening, there is always a precursor of psychological abuse prior to that.
Yes, and I guess in some ways, I mean, you can't say that from the data. It would require proper academic research to look at it, but you could assume, I think, rationally, that it's an elevation of the form of psychological abuse. So there is a history of psychological abuse, and then it's elevated up to the level of, I'm now going to take your kids away from you as well, on top of everything else. So yeah, it does appear to be a precursor. If we go to next slide. And next again. So here we're looking at interpretations, insights, and questions around family domestic violence. The first thing is targeted parents are, on average, 1/3 more likely to report also being a victim of physical, financial, and psychological abuse, i.e., that is, historical family domestic violence behaviors are both predictive and potentially diagnostic factors in parental alienation. What's most interesting is that physical historical abuse was the highest or most prevalent previous family history. And then when you look at the fact that 88% of the respondees who said that they were alienated were actually men, that's a bit of a surprise to us. So a history of physical abuse, female to male, was the most predictive thing for later parental alienation. So next, please. The next thing to look at is that 100% of targeted parents for alienation reported also having experienced psychological abuse. And again, I think it's pretty obvious to anyone that's experienced it that it's a form of psychological abuse. But again, from an academic perspective, this correlation is so strong, literally 100%, that it strongly points to psychological abuse being a key factor in parental alienation. And I don't know that it always is actually linked in that way. Okay, next question. Or next point, I should say, which is a question. It raises, in my mind, something quite interesting. I did a bit of research using AI to try and identify how much money and effort do we put into family domestic violence and to what extent it is actually focused on psychological abuse. And it was quite surprising what I found. The first is that we've spent between $7.5 and $8 billion on awareness, prevention, and support of family domestic violence this last decade. But I was struggling to find how any of that was actually focused on psychological abuse, particularly because it would appear to disproportionately affect children. If we're only looking at the adult to adult dynamic, are we actually looking at the form of abuse which clearly reported by our clients is actually significantly impacting a large number of Australian children? That's one of the questions we would be raising. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the insight here, it's number 3, is there is value in researching the extent to which specific types of family domestic violence or a history of them is predictive and a diagnostic factor in parental alienation.
Because what you've demonstrated so far is that parental alienation doesn't just come out of nowhere.
That's exactly right.
Always a history of other types of domestic violence
Yeah,
prior to that.
Absolutely. In fact, I mean, again, 100% correlation is not causation, but there's 100% correlation between historical psychological abuse and parental alienation. So yes, it is true to say there is always a history that predates it. And again, until we looked at this data, I was not aware that anyone has looked at this. It surprised us, as I've mentioned. So I think this is another area that academics may wish to actually look at more closely. Mm-hmm. Okay, so next slide, please. Insight number 4. Despite very substantial family domestic violence funding, psychological abuse in family breakdown persists, and it suggests a need for more targeted support. Now, I do need to be careful about this because let's be clinically correct about this. Is it that what we're doing in Australia is not working, or are we not doing the right things at all? And they're not the same thing. For example, it could be that we're doing a lot of good work and were that good work not in place, we'd have 100 times more cases of parental alienation related to psychological abuse than we already have. I would hazard a guess, based on my experience over the last decade working with police, the courts, and thousands of parents, that in fact, we're not treating psychological abuse as seriously as it needs to be. It's not as obvious, therefore it tends to take a lower priority, and we're paying the price for it. But that's one of the challenges. To what extent is that very substantial funding being pumped into effective interventions around psychological abuse and then therefore parental alienation?
Pete, I just want to pause there and remind our audience to please use the QR codes and the prompts in the chat to submit any questions that they might have around some of this content that you're sharing with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Sure. So next slide, please. Okay. Next insight is the current family domestic violence strategies. And here I'm thinking of frontline first responder, likely law enforcement stroke police. So current family domestic violence strategies likely overlook the gravity of impact of inadequate early intervention, i.e. upstream, to prevent parental alienation cases downstream. So if we were to intervene in cases of psychological abuse in a different way, perhaps we could cut off some of these cases from ever having occurred. So next slide, please. So this is the third and last section that we're going to talk about, because as I mentioned, time is very limited today, but there's a lot of stuff I'd love to share, but let's just have a look at the support experience, because perhaps for us it's most relevant, but it's also relevant to anyone who's experiencing parental alienation and watching this. What's it like getting support out there? So next slide, please. First thing is when we examine, and I'm just going to rattle through a bunch of numbers very quickly here, but to what extent do you, as a person responding to this survey, say that we have helped you cope with family domestic violence as a victim of parental alienation? Now, our focus is not necessarily on domestic violence. It's about helping them stay alive and in their kids' lives. But we were interested to see to what impact do we have. And 85% of our clients said that actually it did help them. 15% said no. So we're not addressing it for everyone. But interestingly, that's not our core focus anyway. We're suicide prevention, not domestic violence. Next slide, please. The next question was looking at the experience of our parents and where they went for help, and was it a positive experience? Did it help? We're glad to see that peer support had the most positive rating in terms of support at 77%. It's broadly in line with what we tend to see from year to year. Interestingly, GPs and psychologists, friends and family featured quite well in the high 60s. And then we get to the remaining expertise and agencies out there that parents might turn into. Lawyers rated the best. About a third of people said, yes, they did a good service for them. What was most interesting to me was DV services, police and courts down the bottom. And if we tie that back to the previous section that looked at domestic violence, that is very interesting. We're pumping $7.5 to $8 billion into this over a decade, and yet only 15% of parents who've reached out to DV services have actually found any positive support. That's quite disturbing. Next, please. Reducing suicidality. So where our parents have said that they have felt suicidal, we measured them before and after support. So pre-support, 65.5% said that they were considering suicide. It was, there's a level of suicidality, as we say in the industry. Post-support, it drops down to 10%. What's most interesting there is that we asked the question before us, after us. What we didn't take into account was that a third of our respondees have only ever actually interacted with us once or twice. And we do know from historical data that if you interact with us at least 3 times, you tend to have that suicidality drop to near zero. But 1/3 of the responders have only been once or twice. So that's not a surprise to us that it's sitting at 10%. Perhaps we should have asked the question a bit differently. But again, regardless of that, it's an astonishing reduction in suicide. And given that that is our core business, we're very pleased to have seen that we seem to be having that impact across Australia.
That is a very significant drop.
It is.
In risk, given maybe just 1 or 2 interactions.
Yeah, it is quite interesting, not least that we often hear at conferences that universities will measure drops of 1 or 2% and say that that's significant and statistically relevant. But we're looking at orders of magnitude more than that. So we're actually quite pleased, but we've been doing it for 26 years, so we're not surprised. That's what we're seeing. So next slide. Would you recommend Parents Beyond Breakup support to PA victim? Oh, back again, please. Right. Would you recommend Parents Beyond Breakup support to PA victims? 94% said yes. No one said no. The remaining 6% were neutral, bit undecided. But again, I don't think I'm going to argue with that. You're never going to get 100% of people say that you're awesome. I'm very, very pleased with that. And I'm very proud of our team and everything that they do, because most of us are volunteers. So next, please. Thematic analysis. So just reaching the end of my time on this one. Very quickly, what we're looking at here is at the end of the survey of about 50 questions, we actually asked two core questions, which is what is it that you most like about the support you are getting from us? And then what would you like to see from us? So if we go next, please. Given that parents could go anywhere with this, the thing that they said they most liked was peer support and a shared experience. Number two was empathy and validation. And I'm going to tie that back in again now. Now, empathy is intuitive because you're sitting amongst other people who are going through the same thing as you. So that's wonderful to see. And it's a natural outcome of peer support in a way that no other kind of support, including professional GP psychologists, can actually match. And if we look at the validation, isn't that interesting? Because going back to the very first set of slides when we said, 2/3 of people would quite often be referred to as you're not a parental alienation case. We hear this from professionals in the field all the time. You're making it up. You're not an alienation case. Well, given that it's a spectrum, they're probably on that journey most often. So validation is a very interesting point. Lastly was the practical support and guidance that they get. If we could have next, please. More importantly, what would they like to see more of? So the first thing was increased awareness and outreach around parental alienation. There were notable mentions of education in the public and court-based support. Interestingly, I guess what we're doing through this series is education. So we are looking at that, and we are actually currently about to launch court-based support in Tasmania as a trial. And actually, again, no surprises there because previous surveys have shown exactly the same thing. We're working on it, and it's interesting that the same things emerged this time around with new parents. The second thing was expanded access to services. So people were asking for a 24-hour helpline, live chat interaction with the younger generation, and potentially a mobile app to allow easier access to what we do. Again, we're working on the 24-hour helpline right now, and both the live chat and mobile app are in our list of strategies that we're working on. Lastly, enhanced legal and systemic support. Notably, again, a lot of people referred specifically to advocacy as opposed to activism. So activism is the intent to force change. With advocacy, our role as a suicide charity is to actually sit there, collect the data from our clients, and sit in Parliament or speak to professionals and say, here's what we've learned. This is the experience of our parents. We don't necessarily have the answers. That's not our area of expertise, but we speak on behalf of our clients to say, this is your experience. So we're very happy with that's come through. It is what we do. It's a lot of what we focus on. And certainly in the last 12 months, we've started ramping up our advocacy work, not least this series of events and the research. Next slide, please. I think it's just the last one, so you'll be glad to know that we're nearly there. So next, please. So just a very quick summary to end with. What are the insights and key takeaways? One is mums and dads report broadly the same experience of PA. PA being on a spectrum suggests the need for early diagnostic tools. There is a predictive diagnostic value in researching the links between family domestic violence and parental alienation. I don't think anyone's done that, as far as I'm aware. Consider how current FDV support, particularly government funding, addresses psychological abuse. Does it, and is it effective, even if it does? 5 is the appropriate intervention in specific types of FDV, and we're looking at physical, financial, and psychological, which may in turn reduce or avert later PA. Not for everyone, but it may avert some cases. And lastly, the confirmation that peer support is highly rated in parental alienation, and it's pretty effective at reducing the associated suicidality. And I think the next slide. And that's it. So from my perspective, I'm sorry if I've taken a little too much time. There's a lot to cover. I wish I could do the other 27 or so elements that I wanted to. Happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Pete. That was a lot, and you squeezed it into a short time frame. But the statistics were great, and the summaries and the insights, I think, are how we run the business and how we see the impact of parents beyond breakup, how our clients are experiencing it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask that actually, with the services that PBB are providing, that seems to fit in that space of getting in early intervention, that perhaps there aren't too many other services available.
That's absolutely right. So look, we started off as a suicide prevention charity, and we operate peer support. What's interesting and has emerged over the last 5 or 6 years, particularly in Australia, that is a world leader in suicide research, is that there are 3 core stages to suicide. And I'll relate this back to parental alienation in a moment. There's the initial initiating factors. So how does the journey towards suicide commence? And it's factors like who I am as an individual, my resilience, life events, where I live, and the environment around me. That stage can kick off the process. I'll jump to the last stage, which is the crisis intervention stage, where we need to do something about it because someone is already suicidal. And you have organizations that support it either, and so, typically Beyond Blues, that kind of organization is awesome at the first stage, preventing the journey from starting by focusing on people's mental health. At the final crisis intervention stage, you have organizations like Lifeline. They're phenomenally good at interrupting that final bit. But in the middle stage, which is the downward spiral, there's almost nothing. And organizations like ours fit into that section. And it's not well recognized, but it's slowly being recognized in suicide that if they've already commenced the journey, then it's easier for us to kick them off that journey in that middle downward spiral than it is to have to deal with it when they get to crisis stage. So as a country, we've recognized that we're starting to pump funding into that middle downward spiral stage. We haven't done that with parental alienation, but because so many of our clients, specifically our clients, experience it, we've now looked at it and said, that's really interesting. We look at cases and diagnose them once they're already confirmed and have gone too far. And at that point, you're struggling to turn around those children. We're not very good at identifying the journey that leads up to it and then being able to have diagnostic tools that identify it and then interrupt it, or even understanding how to interrupt it. If we know that there's a history of psychological abuse, why are we not interrupting it before it gets to the extreme of I'm going to take your kids off you and make you suffer for it? In fact, in course, make the children suffer as well.
Yes, the children obviously being the victims there that too often don't get hurt. So I'm just going to put some questions to you that we've had from the audience, if that's all right, Pete. Based on your research and ongoing support to parents in these circumstances, what legislative changes would be needed to address this important matter?
Oh, that's very technical and very specific. I'm going to zoom out on this one a little bit and perhaps give you an overview of some evidence that I gave to Parliament in 2017 on behalf of Parents Beyond Breakup. And that is, as advocates, it's not our job to understand the law or to say you need to change this or you need to change that, because quite often you find in these kind of complex circumstances that you make a change and then you get the law of unintended consequences that you don't know how it affects other people in other circumstances. So with a background in organizational psychology, I would zoom out and say to you that you can create, and this is the evidence we gave in Parliament, you can create incentives for the right behaviors and you can create consequences for the wrong behaviors. And neither of those things happen. At the moment, there are rewards for the wrong behaviors and there are zero to very few consequences for the wrong behaviors. So if I intentionally take the children off my partner, what is going to happen to me? Almost nothing. In fact, I may get rewarded for it financially through a settlement. I may get it through child support. That's not necessarily technically true these days with the way child support works, but there's still a perception I will get reward for doing that. There are no consequences, and there are no rewards for doing things correctly. Sticking to the rules and not making false allegations in your partner. Often you end up being the victim of your partner who is making false allegations, and we see that very commonly. So I would say the legislative changes and the systemic changes that need to occur at all levels within the courts and outside of the courts, so legislative and non-legislative, is to focus on consequences for the wrong behaviors, incentives for the right behaviors. And it's for other brainiacs to work out what those are.
Right, but I suppose a lot of the evidence would show that those behaviors that we see leading up to the result of parental alienation, those would be the behaviors that we would want to try and stop.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Pete. Another question. Do we know of any research that correlate personality disorders to family violence, psychological abuse, and therefore onto parental alienation?
Do you know, specifically, not that I could quote, but I can point you towards an individual, Dr. Elise Price-Tobler, who is a parental alienation expert. She's done 2 doctorates. She's written quite a few books on this. She has spoken at one of our previous events, and I hope that we'll see her at one of our major annual events coming up. She specifically writes about this in her book. She has done it as part of her doctorate. I will admit to not knowing the numbers off the top of my head, but she has specifically made that link. It's one of the areas in which I would say she's probably a global leader in this, in identifying the link between severe mental health, including personality disorders, resulting domestic violence, behavior patterns, and then how it ends up in parental alienation at the back end. So maybe retracting a little bit on what I said earlier, there is someone out there looking at the link between the two. It's Elise. She's an Aussie, which is awesome, and she's a world leader in this. But the data for me, actually showed for the first time some statistics around it outside of the work of Dr. Bryce Tobler. So I would say look at her work, read her book, but you'll find it in there. She makes the link quite clearly.
Yeah, that's important because it seems to me that it would be a fairly easy jump to say, well, somebody who's behaving in that way may have some sort of personality disorder, but
Yep.
we need the evidence for that. We need to show that.
Yep.
Thanks, mate. Where is the support, emotional and practical, for the children of the families in parental alienation circumstances?
Oh, that is such a good question. Okay, I'm actually, given that I've just mentioned Dr. Elise Bryce Tobler, the unique thing about Elise here in Australia is that she is herself a child who's alienated, has grown into adulthood, and has experienced alienation herself as an adult as well. The unique perspective that she brings is, well, what about us? What about the kids? Who gets to look at the kids? And certainly her challenge has shifted my mindset around what we should be doing. There isn't much support out there at the moment. We look after dads, mums. Quite a few years ago, we expanded out to grandparents. More recently, we've expanded out to Indigenous and veterans. But the latest thing that we're working on is actually looking after young people, children. Now, this is not something that we necessarily have expertise in, working with kids, and we recognize where we're good and where we're not. But we are looking to develop training programs around family separation and parental alienation, and to teach this to school counselors, to youth workers, etc. So we pass on our expertise to people who know or have expertise in working with children. So that is something that's months away. So watch this space. We'll be launching that. Outside of that, I don't know that there's anything out there. There is the expertise in the form of Dr. Bryce Tobler. There is the network and the movement that she has kicked off. I think she refers to it as nothing about us without us, which makes sense if you stop and think about it. There's a whole sector there talking about parental alienation, but ignoring the actual kids of it who've grown up and suffered from it. So she's bringing a new perspective to the table, and certainly we will be working with Dr. Bryce Tobler in the future around raising the voice of children, adult children of parental alienation, in an effort to try and address some of the problems. But in terms of support, I'm not aware that there's anything out there specifically outside of individuals who might work with kids who are very good at this. Names that pop into my head off the top of my head in the UK would be Karen and Nick Woodall. In Australia, I'm not entirely sure I know of anyone that specifically works with kids. I'm sure there might be. But outside of the work that we're looking to develop, I'm not aware that there is anything, I'm sorry.
But a general understanding with things like this conference that we're running, a general understanding of PA with those that are working with children can only help them recognize that early and support those children, surely.
Well, actually, interestingly, at one of our earlier events, I won't say which, one of the members of the audience was a senior person in the child protection team at the local social services. And she was blown away by what she learned. She didn't understand what parental alienation was and the impact of it. And she subsequently come back to us and said to us a few times that she is now looking at changing their practice. So interestingly, just running these events and having professionals come along and hear about it is causing them to go, wow, okay, I wasn't aware of that. I just didn't know. And now it's opening up a new world to them. So we're happy to take the credit for that. But yeah, I think that's all we can do at the moment in line with what the parents have asked us, get the word out there. Raise the awareness and consciousness around this matter.
Yeah, it's important to talk about. And those of us at PBB that have those conversations with other professionals, we do see that the light coming into their eyes when they realise that there's more to it than suddenly it's on the surface. There's a question here about where there is danger to a child, and how come the person that is abusing the child is not tested in some way before the alienation occurs, and that child and parent lose months or even years of a relationship?
Well, okay, that goes back to the presentation in the sense that if we look at the journey of suicide, we now have it well mapped out. Okay, there is a model in the world of suicide or the sector of suicide called the IMV model, integrational, motivational, volitional model. That's the 3 stages that I referred to earlier. Understanding that journey or mapping out that journey allows us to say, well, what could we do at different stages? The world of suicide has got that licked, at least in Australia. We're pretty advanced in Australia compared to the rest of the world in terms of understanding of it and addressing it. If we look at parental alienation, that map doesn't exist, or not that I'm aware of, and I've been looking for it. I've worked in the sector for a while. It's not easy to find if it exists. We haven't really mapped that process out. I think that's one of the challenges we have to the academic world, map it out from how does it begin, what causes it to kick off, how does it develop, and then how does it manifest in its final stages. What we have is the 5-factor model, which definitively is the suicide equivalent of looking at the crisis intervention stage. It's saying, okay, we now have a full-blown case of parental alienation. This child refuses any contact with their alienated parent, mum or dad. That's what we have. We need to map out the whole journey, and we need to understand earlier interventions. That I'm aware of, they don't exist. That's the problem. Right now, the only interventions that can occur are either systemic ones emerging out of the court deciding on its own merit that we should do something around this case, but they rarely do that because they tend to follow process, and a process in law requires definitive evidence. All right, so the law will generally not deal with it, but they could theoretically currently. The other one is if you happen to have an expert that understands this, but is working on their own merit. So they have their own expertise. They understand this. You know, classic on our own board is Dr. Stan Carosi. He understands this intimately. He can intervene earlier in a case and actually say, here's what we should be doing. But that's a rarity. There are very few experts out there. So there is no systemized way of understanding it and therefore knowing what to do about it. And that's the challenge that emerges out of this.
Yeah. I'd like to actually talk about what we do at PBB in the support groups and with our helpline, because that partly fills that gap.
Yes.
Where you've got a child, a case of parental alienation that's happening, the parents that come along for support, they learn some of those techniques and some of that understanding of the process, so that if they have any interaction and contact with their child, and many don't, but those that do, learn from their peers, what to look for, how to support that child, because there's the real risk that they may take that hostility from a child that's being turned against them, and they may react negatively to that rather than having an understanding.
Yeah.
So that's something that PBB does in the support groups.
It does. And actually, if I use a personal example, I can't talk on behalf of others. I can talk about myself. For 11 years, I didn't see my first daughter. And I probably only had a handful of occasions when I managed to see her through a court-appointed psychologist or otherwise for anywhere between a minute and 5 minutes. And each of those interactions, I'm not going to claim intelligence or anything. There was no forethought in it. It was just randomly I got it right. Out of millions of people, somebody's randomly going to get it right. I got it right that it was always positive. It was always happy. And some of the feedback that she gave me when she reached adulthood and came back to me was that reset everything that was done to her or said to her in the intervening periods, which is very interesting. It took minutes to reverse years of an attempt to convince her that I was someone other than I am. So that's interesting. And I guess that's one of the things that emerges out of our support groups, that sometimes you have to think about, what does the child need? It's not me. I'm suffering. Yes, I am suffering. I'm angry as hell. I want to change the world. I want to force it to change because it's not acceptable what's going on. But at the same time, you live in the reality that you live in right now. And the best thing you can do is be child-centric. And I think that emerges out the conversations we have with our mums and dads.
Yeah. I'm not going to take that was luck, Pete. Those of us that know you,
I think it's luck.
The understanding and empathy that you show, and the willingness to get down and hear what somebody's problems really are and respond to that. That wasn't luck that you responded in that way.
But it's kind of me. I don't think I deserve it, but thank you.
Here's an interesting question. So why are courts and family law professionals saying that parental alienation is false?
Okay, now I need to make an assumption around this. The reason they might be saying it's not correct or real is the way the law works, right? So the law is very precise. It works on evidence, not supposition, meaning that for a court to look at parental alienation and say it exists, there's a number of things that have to happen. The first is that it needs to exist in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual version 5, the current DSM-5. For those of you who are not aware what the DSM-5 is, it's an outline, it's a formal outline. I believe it's the American Psychological Society, APS, that publishes it every few years. They will update it. We're currently at version 5. If a mental health pathology is not in the DSM-5, then the courts say it doesn't exist. So unless the American Psychological Society agrees it is a known phenomena, we can define it, we can diagnose it. This goes back to diagnostic tools. If we can diagnose it, it's a real thing, okay? If it's not in the DSM-5, then courts across the Western world will say, well, number one, if you bring it up in court, what would you like me to test? Because it doesn't exist according to the professionals, right? So that's number one. That's why you sometimes see professionals say it's not real. They're not telling you they don't believe you're experiencing what you're experiencing. They're telling you there's no way for me to define it, therefore deal with it. That's number one. The second thing goes back to the diagnostic tool. If you can only measure it and prove it, let's assume that the 5-factor model is accepted, and this is why it's a good thing. I don't want to come across as I'm knocking it. It's a good thing, all right? But it's more of a coroner's perspective, right? I've assessed why the patient died, and it's definitive. They died of this, right? So in that sense, that could make its way towards, or help make our way towards the DSM-5 accepting it. But for the time being, we don't have early diagnostic tools. Therefore, what is a court to do about that? It's almost like you're going into court and you're asking them to address a problem that they say, well, doesn't exist. And even then, you don't have any diagnostic tools to prove that you're at an early stage of this thing that doesn't exist. It's a really frustrating problem. It will improve over time, right? Because people are working on getting it into the DSM-5 or DSM-6, I should say, and people are working potentially on diagnostic tools. Our challenge is work harder and faster on getting that journey mapped out and getting early diagnostic tools and predictive tools. I don't know that there's any, I don't know how else to kind of address the problem, but I think that's the key problem that you're seeing. I used to think otherwise, Phil, but now, having been in this game for over 20 years, having spoken to thousands of parents, having gone into court multiple times, having spoken to multiple judges, attorney generals, barristers, lawyers, it's a technical problem. Actually, that's another interesting perspective on this. How are we going to why do the courts say it doesn't exist? Is the court the right tool for this job? The court is an evidence-based adversarial system trying to address a complex emotional problem. Family court probably isn't. The reason the family courts exist is because the normal legislative kind of process doesn't actually work very well. So they try to create something that's more family friendly and relevant. But I don't know that we've gone far enough. We've kind of softened the hammer, but the hammer isn't the right tool. Maybe it's a completely different tool. That's another challenge as well. So if you're looking to the courts and saying they don't recognize it, it's like, maybe it shouldn't be in the courts in the first place. I don't know, that might be a frustrating response, but it's a fact. It might not be the right tool to begin with.
Yeah, I would expand this because this comes up a lot in the support groups is, do we necessarily need to use the label of PA in the court?
No.
And there, a lot of people manage to get their point across by just stating the actual behaviours.
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, that's an interesting point as well. So if parental alienation is not recognized within the DSM-5, what is? Now, I'm embarrassed because I can't quote off the top of my head, but you can look it up yourself. There are a category of mental health pathologies which collectively might fall under what you might call pathogenic parenting, right? They're kind of personality disorder type things that we know will impact a parent's ability to be a decent parent and not impact that child negatively. If you were to identify those, or if you have experts that can help assess your situation, go, okay, it does meet the criteria for 1, 2, 3 pathogenic parenting kind of category pathologies that do exist, and you have some evidence to show that they exist, you can possibly convince the court. In fact, the court should respond favorably to this is the evidence to say that these conditions that are recognized exist. On this date, this happened. On this date, this happened. On this date, this happened. You don't tell them that the pathology exists. You say, these are the behaviors that can be evidenced, and we believe that it could possibly be this thing that's recognized. Then you can ask for that person to be assessed. The court can respond to that. It's something that they can say yes to, versus asking them to deal with parental alienation where the court says, well, we don't recognize that title. What do you want us to do about that? Yeah. It's not within our remit. So you kind of have to look at it strategically and say, well, what is in a DSM-5 that can be brought into the court? The court will then accept it.
Yeah, and you can demonstrate other conditions,
yeah,
and you can demonstrate actual behaviors.
Yeah.
Because the way that it comes up in the groups is, if somebody was to be physically abusing their partner, You don't have to get a diagnosis of them being a psychopath
No.
to prove the behaviour still exists, whether you can put a label on it or not. So I think that's sometimes the danger with PA is people are so bent on trying to prove it and push it that they're missing the easy path of just saying, well, these are the behaviours and this is the impact on the child, on the family unit, on the mental health and development of the children.
Well, actually, this relates back to your earlier point about the power of the groups. It's sometimes really hard to define why is it that what we do is so effective at reducing hopelessness, isolation, and suicide. And one of them is helping you understand the language of the court. I mean, going into the court and using your own language, which I did, so I'm not knocking anyone that's watching this or listening here. I would have gone in and argued about parental alienation, not understood why it was being ignored in the UK courts. The fact is they speak a different language. So I guess one of the things that we do is we help our parents, mums, dads, grandparents, veterans, hopefully kids in the future, understand this is how the system works. If this is what you're experiencing, let's help you learn the language that allows you to be understood when you're in court. That's a massive thing. And outside of people like ourselves or individual lawyers who put the effort in, I don't know that anyone out there is actually doing that. Everyone else seems to be focused on activism, if I might say, like pushing against the system. It must change, it must change. But the reality is it does need to change, but it's not going to happen in our lifetime, not radically, I don't think anyway. Things are slow in the world of law. It's going to change slowly. So you have to face the reality that if I've got a case right now, I have to deal with the reality in front of me. So, you know, being an activist and running into court and screaming, and this is what I demand of you right now, it's not going to get you what you want. It's just not.
A change in the law or process in 5 or 10 years is not helping somebody who's going through it right now.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it's about the kids who are going through it right now. And what can you do to optimize? As frustrating as it is, it's the only way to deal with this. Yeah. And the sooner you get there, the sooner your case potentially gets addressed, potentially.
So peer support really is more where the rubber hits the road. It's hearing from people that have tried something, did it work, how was it interpreted, what was the outcome? So you're really hearing real case scenarios every week.
Yeah, 100%.
We've had a question about the data that you've presented to us today. Will that be available online after the event?
Right, I may do. I mean, I pulled this together very quickly for today. We will definitely be publishing it in full by the 12th of October, before the 12th of October. We're going to be doing something for Parental Alienation Day this year. And so we want to get the full report out there. In view of the question, I presume there's a bit of interest out there. I'll see that we get it out sooner rather than later. So yeah, I guess we'll put it out on socials. We'll put it on our website within a few days. Give me a few days, we'll get it out there.
Watch this space. Thanks, Pete. Now, what about volunteers? Because PBB is a largely volunteer-supported organisation. How do people volunteer to help?
Oh boy, we love volunteers. Okay, so we're majority volunteer. We're about 90% volunteers around the country. We always have been. I don't think that will ever change. There's never enough money in this game to actually employ everyone. So, you know, to your point, where the rubber hits the road is down to individuals who are prepared to put their hand up and do something about it. Volunteering, very easy. Go to our website, pbb.org.au, and at the top you'll see, I think from memory, it's give support, get support. So if it's get support, dads, mums, grandparents, all that. If you look at the give support section, it'll say volunteer. It's one of the options. Volunteer, fill out the form. There is a role for just about anyone and everyone in Australia who wants to volunteer. So it doesn't matter if you're male, female, young, old, black, white, we don't care. Volunteer, there's something you can do based on who you are. I will say one thing, if you want to work with parents directly, we have one golden rule, which we've had for 26 years. We're not going to change it. And that is everyone that works with parents is a lived experience person. So if you want to work with separated dads, you got to be a separated dad. Likewise for mums, likewise for grandparents. But outside of that, there are 1,000,001 roles, from raising awareness to managing groups to handling our website, social media. There's a million jobs. If you want to give back, there's a way to do it. And we love anyone that wants to volunteer. You're saving lives. In fact, I think one of the true things to say is we are so effective at suicide prevention that if you actually care about suicide prevention, we're probably one of the most effective places in the country to actually to volunteer. You can make a real difference in your community.
Yeah. Yes, and we've demonstrated that with the data that we're making an impact.
Sure.
I'm just going to read through the next question, and I don't know what have we got here. So, would you agree that the 18 alienating behaviours are the precursor to parental alienation, or the personality disorders are the precursors?
Wow. Okay. So I'm not entirely sure I know what the reference to 18 alienating behaviors are. I mean, the most common model that I'm aware of, because bear in mind, our focus is keeping parents alive and in their kids' lives. We're suicide prevention. PA is increasingly an enormous part of what we do because we have to, because it's so prevalent. So I would say my expertise is not in that. So I'm aware of the 5-factor model, and I agree that it is a very good definition of a serious, definitive end stage case. In terms of 18 alienating behaviors, I'm not sure what that reference is. Elise Tobler, Price Tobler, she talks about personality disorders. I would agree with that 100%. I have yet to come across a case where it's quite clear that the person on the other side has some level of personality disorder. Not least that, let's look at it another way. So again, if I zoom out of the problem and look at it in its entirety, if we look at the family courts publish, I haven't checked recently, but they publish their annual reports, and they love to talk about how good they are at their job. So they talk about how many cases they've looked at and how many cases they've managed to agree some level of contact. Now, that in itself is a very interesting piece of insight if you look at the behavior of the alienating parent. I'll explain why. If you've got roughly 10,000 new cases every year, and the courts are, proud of the fact that in 80, 90% of cases, close to 90% the last time I looked, we've managed to actually agree that contact should take place. What you're looking at is one individual who's saying no contact and is using Section 60cc of the Family Law Act to indicate that the person who wants contact is a risk of harm to the child. And yet in 90% of the cases, over a prolonged period of time, with all the evidence put in, examined by experts, tested in court by, barristers, ripping people to shreds, looking at the evidence, at the end of all of that, they ignore the original complaint. So it's either false or it's exaggerated to the point where we don't agree that that original complaint actually stands and we're now ordering contact. What does that tell you about 90% of cases in the court? Somebody's sitting there, they either struggle to interpret reality or they're outright lying in an effort to damage someone else's life. If that isn't personality disorder driven, I don't know what is. There's something quite wrong there. It's often missed when people they miss the obvious statistics. That one is one of the ones that had a really interesting conversation with the previous Chief Justice around that. And even he was like, wow, never thought about it that way. You're right. It says there's a real problem.
Yeah.
And it goes back to consequences. What's the consequence for someone who intentionally or otherwise lied to the point where someone else, a child suffers from the loss of their other parent? What's the consequence of that? Appears apparently nothing. That's an astonishing thing.
That leads to something that I say and have seen, 15 years of running in the groups and being in the groups, that I've seen a lot. And a lot of people bristle at this, which is that it seems to me that the outcomes from the family law courts are quite reasonable and just. The problem is getting there.
Yeah.
When all of the evidence is seen and heard, the actual outcomes are very usually, a lot of people come back after years of going through their cases. They'll come back to the groups, they'll talk about their journey, they'll talk about their results, and you see that they actually get quite a fair outcome. The problem and the damage is getting to that point. So that really marries with what you've just said, that it's kind of proven to be false without them ever actually proving it as false.
I think part of the problem is that the process does generally work, but it puts you through hell getting there, right?
Yes.
So most people can't deal with it. So there's a whole question around, is it too difficult? My argument is clearly, yes, it is way, way, way too difficult. It takes too long, generally, and it's way too expensive. Now, there are ways to address that. I think the system is slowly becoming conscious of the fact that they need to change. But again, this comes back to, almost like a mistranslation. It's like, what am I expecting the courts to do versus a court looking at you going, well, what is it you want me to do? Do you understand what I am? So, if you look at the fundamental basis of what the courts are, this might surprise people, but I won't refer to the names, but we're talking at Chief Justice levels, conversations around what is the court? And I was challenged to say, well, do you understand what the courts are? And part of the explanation to me was that courts are designed to retain stability and status quo in society, right? So if some behavior gets out of hand, our job is to bring it back in line. You can look at it purely from a criminality and legal perspective, but it's about retaining stability in society. So what does that look like in a family court? So if you look at the interpretation through the eyes of a senior family court judge, our job is to preserve stability and status quo. If the status quo in Australia is that 70% of care is done by mums and 30% is done by dads, that's what the Australian Institute of Family Studies says. They're the guys that do the research. At the point of separation, most parents will say, well, hang on a second, we now need to relook at this because our circumstances have changed. From a court's point of view, it's like, no, you're gonna get back in line and we're gonna have that split. And so whichever partner tries to move away from that status quo starts to grate on the system, and the system tries to get them to comply back again. And so that's the purpose of the court. So again, we were talking about how do you approach a court around the matter of parental alienation. One of the issues is to actually even understand what the court is. And if you're going to say something that's outside of the standard norm, then you have to have an extraordinary justification to shift them. And a lot of people don't understand that. They will run into court and they'll say, I want 50-50. And the courts will go, so what? That's not what we're here to do. Why are you asking me to do that when that's not what I do? And people are shocked by that, or they don't even understand that that's the response, because it's not the job of the court to educate you on how the law works or what the court is. It's your job to educate yourself about what that system is if you're going to go into it and ask it to do something. None of this is meant to be egotistical, but it is complex as hell. It took me over 20 years to get my head around it. It took me, luckily through my work, to sit with prime ministers and attorney generals and chief justices to start to get my head around, well, how do they think? What are they looking at versus what we're looking at? I'm glad that as an organization, we kind of do a lot of that work, the right kind of work at the front line to actually educate people around how to work with the system we have, whether we like it or not, whether it's functional or not, it's the one we've got. How do you best work with it? But we stumbled upon that. But I'm glad that that's literally the only thing you can do, I think.
That is a bit of, is it the right tool for the job? But it's not a tool we're stuck with.
Yeah. The only tool we have is a dysfunctional hammer, so let's use it. God, that sounded actually quite, that's from a domestic violence, but let's not use that analogy anymore. But the old analogy, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem is a nail. And that's kind of the issue of the courts. We've only got the courts, so what else are we going to use? Until we develop something else, that's it.
Yeah. Well, we've got some more questions, and I'm going to just keep powering through. So somebody's asked, is there an online toolkit for adults in the alienation dynamics for scripts to use with their alienated children? Do we have anything published online that kind of that will duplicate and communicate the types of lessons that are learned in the groups here at PBB?
In terms of alienation dynamics and how you approach the problem, not that I'm aware of. I'm not aware that there is anything specific out there. Again, you may find that individual experts like Dr. Stan Carosi on our board and Dr. Elise Bryce-Dobler, they may have individual kind of perspectives on how you address some of these things. I don't know if they have specific toolkits. Interestingly, I've never asked the question. It's a really good question. I think I'm going to actually go out and research that. If there is anything out there, we'll put it out on our website. But I'm not aware of anything like that. I mean, we are looking to do something as an organization soon. I think a reference was recently made, funny enough, by Bettina Arndt to it online. Not sure how she got to hear about it, but that we are looking at developing a self-represented litigant workshop and an ongoing support group around that. Now, it's not specifically targeted at parental alienation, but I don't see why it wouldn't involve a lot of how do you handle a parental alienation case. And actually, this is a really good challenge. So whoever asked that, thank you for that. You've just altered some of the materials that we're looking to develop just there, right there and then. So you're making a difference in real time. We will alter the materials around the self-represented litigant workshops that we're doing. And there, just to give an insight into what we're doing, we're developing a range of fact sheets, which we're going to put on our website, which give a broad outline to typically what's the process of separation, typically how do the courts operate, which courts, different levels of judiciary, what can they individually do? because different judges have different levels of authority on what they can order. Another common problem, people walk into court thinking, I'm going to get my kid back today. And it's like, no, you're 3 levels away from the judge that you need to make that. So it's kind of outlining the basic stuff you need to know day one. So we're looking to develop that very soon. We're talking a few months at most. That will be made available free. We've got a whole bunch of very helpful lawyers who are helping us for free, pro bono. See, there are some nice ones who are looking to develop that with us. So that's your introduction. Very simple, easy to absorb, 10 kind of pages. And then it will be bolstered by a weekly session that people can jump onto and speak to Mackenzie friends, lawyers, and experienced self-represented litigants where they can ask their questions and develop strategies in real time for free. Everything we do is developed by lived experience expertise for free to the client. So that may address part of what's being asked here, but I'm sorry that I'm not aware of any toolkit that exists out there outside of what we're doing right now.
Well, look, I would expand on that and say, I don't think there is a one size fits all sort of solution. So going with any prescribed method or prompts may not be the best. You know, get in contact with Parents Beyond Breakup. Call our helpline 1300-853-437 and speak to one of the helpline agents. Everybody there is a peer in some fashion, and because every family situation is different, everybody's challenges are different, and markedly the children that are involved, the children that they're trying to reestablish a relationship with, their needs are different.
Well, actually, just on that one, again, this is the beauty of the lived experience because we've all gone through it, right? One of the things that I used to find most insanely infuriating in my own case was people saying, it's very complex, and every family is different. I was like, no, it's really straightforward. This is what's happening to me. You just need to address it. The reality is here I am, realistically, 24 years personally later, and I'm now at the pointy end, and I get to sit with the right people, and I get to see in the courts, and I get to see hundreds of different cases, and I get to speak to hundreds of lawyers, and you finally come to the conclusion, bloody hell, it's actually true. Every case is radically different. It is complex as hell. I mean, here's an interesting phenomenon for you. And we know this from sex abuse. Children who are abused sexually can end up being perpetrators themselves. It's not necessarily the case, but it can happen, right? If they perpetrate as an adult, are they a victim or a perpetrator, right? So the reason I'm saying this is quite often, if you look at the cases in the family courts, you have one individual who, for whatever reason, has decided the other parent is a risk. And anyone observing from the outside would say, well, they're not a risk. They're actually half decent parent. I may not agree with everything, but they're fine, right? It's not our job to interfere. They should be having access to their kid. But the other individual truly believes what they're saying. They truly believe. How do you deal with that? I mean, do you take it to an extreme and lock them up, take the children away, put them in another? What do you do with it, right? It's a complex problem. Because so many of these, I mean, in fact, it's the most common reason provided behind the scenes at senior levels when you say, why are people who lie in family court not prosecuted for perjury? It's a common question. I used to think the same thing. Now I look at it from a legal perspective and say, well, you have to prove that they had a guilty mind, or mens rea, I think it's the Latin term. Yes. They were of guilty mind. They intended to do it. Well, how do you prove that they intended to do it if they're delusional in some way, or they have a severe personality disorder and cannot interpret the world correctly? I'm not excusing what happens. I'm just trying to convey it is complex. And another added complexity here is you have the personality of, let's talk about a typical traditional nuclear family. You have the personality of mother, the personality of father, which is going to be different. And then you have a personality of a child or children. And if you have children versus a child, you have different personalities there. Now you're looking at complex family dynamics of them all interacting. In my case, one of my children came back to me and I have the best relationship in the world. The other one, probably never going to see again. 2 different children, same parent, 2 different outcomes. How does that happen? That for me was the evidence that this is complex. Even how a child reacts to the alienator is radically different from one child to the next child. One is susceptible to it, the other one is my oldest is resistant as hell. Nothing was ever going to turn her against me, nothing.
Yeah.
Youngest, not a hope.
Which is why just pulling something offline, online, you know, PDF is not necessarily going to resolve that.
Yeah.
But coming along, speaking to peers, you're talking to the helpline or going to the support groups, allows the parents to bounce those ideas. You know, what happens if I was to send a letter or send a birthday card or drop off a present, you know, Christmas, or how I have weekly calls video calls with my children,
Mm.
but they're not responding the way that I would expect or the way that they used to. All of these topics come up regularly in all of our interactions, all of our conversations, and the responses are not always the same. It depends parent to parent. So you kind of want to run that by others that have been through it and go, what do you think would happen if I said this or tried that?
Yeah. Well, you know, a really common one that comes up time and time again. It's almost like I do want to hand out for this. I always want to just hand it to the other person when I hear it, because it's like often repeated. It's like my kids don't want to talk to me. I'm being alienated. And you say, right, how old are the kids? And they're like, oh, they're 13, 14. And you go, okay, look at any normal, happy, intact family and look at their 13-year-olds to see how much time they want to spend with their parents. It's like they don't want anything to do with their parents. They want to be with their schoolmates. They want to go out doing stuff. They're not interested in their parents. There's normal teenage behavior which overlaps with complex family breakdown. So this is where the complexity comes in. Even the age of the child starts to influence what am I actually looking at and what's the best way to intervene on this. And sometimes with teenagers, you just have to tolerate what they're like, but just keep persisting with them in the knowledge that they probably truly love you, but they're just normal teenagers experiencing a family breakdown.
Right, because there's added stress with that. And it's very easy to look at that and go, well, that must be the other parent turning that child against me.
Yeah.
And I've had a number of those conversations very recently where they're saying, well, you know, my child never used to be like that, or our relationship was different, or they never used to respond or speak to me in that manner or shut down like that. And then you have a number of other parents in the room go, how old are they? That's pretty normal.
Well, I mean, again, my own case, astonishingly close to my eldest daughter when she was young. We got separated, 11 years of separation. There was a period in the middle of that where she was a teenager, didn't want to respond to anything, rejected me. When she came back, and I asked her about that many years later, we were having this discussion about it. And she went, yeah, that was my insane period, Dad. And, you know, meaning I was a teenager. I wasn't thinking rationally at the time. So, yeah, it happens, but astonishingly close now. So, yeah, it's hard to interpret it. It's why it's so complex. You're looking at too many different characteristics, different factors, all interacting at the same time. It is hard as hell. It is really hard as hell. I get that. That said, we do need, this is where the zooming out helps, where you can look at systems of consequence and reward based on outcomes. To my mind, that's a safer place to be than saying, this is what needs to happen in every case. The minute you zoom in, you start risking increasing. The more precise you get, the more you risk the law of unintended consequences.
Which is why Parents Beyond Breakup encourage all of our groups, all of our facilitators, all of our services are viewed through the lens of what is in the best interests of the child.
Yeah, 100%.
Because a parent is coming in probably distressed, disillusioned, and they may not necessarily be thinking clearly, and they may be thinking more about what they're experiencing, not necessarily understanding that their child is probably quite distressed by the separation and the behaviors.
That's normal. Yeah. I mean, look, I think all of us have been there. I was so lost in my own agony and distress, hopelessness, that I wasn't really, for long periods of time, thinking about what does my kid need me to do right now? And that is sometimes hard to put yourself in the shoes of the kid. You kind of say you are, but it is hard to do, and I acknowledge that. And it took years for me to be able to do it.
Thanks, Pete. I think we sort of run to the end of our list of questions here. I know we are moving over to JD a little bit later on. I think we're running a bit behind with time, so we're going to take a short break and we'll come back on. We're going to say thank you very much to you, Pete, and to everybody here in Darwin. And we hope that the online viewers as well have got some value out of this. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.